This book begins in a place most people know but rarely admit: the quiet exhaustion of living a life that looks fine on the outside but feels empty on the inside. When I Finally Chose Myself is not the story of a dramatic collapse. It is the story of a slow erosion, the gradual disappearance of a person who kept saying yes when they wanted to say no, who kept showing up for everyone else while silently abandoning themselves. The narrator begins by describing a life that seemed responsible, productive, and even admirable. There were achievements, there were relationships, there were goals being checked off. But beneath the surface lived a constant tension, a quiet question that refused to disappear. Is this really my life? The discomfort wasn't loud, it didn't explode, it whispered. It showed up in fatigue that sleep couldn't fix, in irritation that had no clear source, in envy toward people who dared to make bold choices. The book explores the subtle ways we betray ourselves, not through major moral failures, but through small daily compromises, staying in conversations that drain us, accepting expectations we never agreed to, living according to scripts we inherited from family, culture, fear, or comparison. Over time, these compromises create an invisible fracture between who we are and who we perform. One of the most powerful insights in this first section is that self-abandonment rarely feels dramatic. It feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels like sacrifice. The narrator believed that being good meant being available, that being strong meant enduring discomfort silently, that being successful meant meeting external standards. But slowly the cost became undeniable. There is a chapter dedicated to the concept of borrowed dreams. The author describes chasing goals that looked impressive but felt hollow, promotions that came with applause but not joy, relationships that looked stable but lacked emotional safety. The realization was painful. Many of the choices made were not born from desire but from fear. Fear of disappointing others, fear of being misunderstood, fear of starting over. The breaking point did not come as a dramatic event. It came as a quiet moment of honesty, sitting alone, feeling an overwhelming sense of misalignment, the kind of exhaustion that no vacation can solve, the kind of sadness that does not have a clear cause. And in that moment came the terrifying question, what if I am the one who has been abandoning me? The book does not romanticize this awakening. It describes the guilt that follows, the fear of being perceived as selfish, the anxiety of imagining change. Choosing yourself feels dangerous when your identity has been built on pleasing others. The narrator describes shaking hands while writing a resignation letter, not just from a job, but from a version of themselves. Part 1 emphasizes that choosing yourself is not about rebellion, it is about responsibility. The responsibility to live honestly, to acknowledge resentment before it turns into bitterness, to admit exhaustion before it becomes collapse. The author argues that many breakdowns are delayed boundaries. There is a particularly moving reflection on the difference between kindness and self-erasure. True kindness comes from fullness. Self-erasure comes from fear. When you constantly suppress your needs, your generosity becomes transactional. You give in hopes of being valued. You serve in hopes of being loved. The first act of choosing yourself, according to the book, is awareness. Not change, not bold moves, just radical honesty. Admitting that something feels wrong. Naming dissatisfaction without immediately justifying it. Allowing yourself to feel anger without labeling it as ingratitude. The section ends with a powerful internal shift. The narrator does not yet know how to rebuild their life. They do not have a 5-step plan, but they make one quiet promise: I will no longer abandon myself to keep others comfortable. It is a small sentence, but it marks the beginning of transformation. Part 1 leaves us at the edge of change, uncomfortable,
uncertain, but finally awake.
When I finally chose myself. If part 1 was about awakening, part 2 is about reconstruction. And reconstruction is far less glamorous than awakening. Realizing that you have been living out of alignment is painful, but deciding to change is terrifying. Awareness opens the door, but action forces you to walk through it. And walking through it often feels like stepping into uncertainty without a map. The narrator begins this section by describing the silence that follows a bold internal decision. No fireworks, no applause, just quiet. The world does not rearrange itself the moment you choose yourself. Your responsibilities remain. The expectations from others do not magically dissolve. What changes first is internal, a shift in perception, a shift in standards, a shift in what you are willing to tolerate. One of the earliest transformations described is learning to pause. For years, decisions were reactive, shaped by urgency, pressure, and the desire to please. Now, there is space between stimulus and response. That space becomes sacred. In it lives choice. The narrator begins asking new questions before committing to anything. Do I actually want this? Am I saying yes out of alignment or fear? Who benefits from this decision? My growth or my insecurity? The book makes it clear that choosing yourself does not mean abandoning responsibility. It means recalibrating it. There is a powerful distinction drawn between selfishness and self-respect. Selfishness ignores the needs of others. Self-respect refuses to ignore your own. For someone who built their identity around being dependable and agreeable, this distinction is revolutionary. The inner shift also involves confronting long-avoided emotions. Anger, especially, becomes a teacher rather than an enemy. The narrator begins to see that suppressed anger was often a signal of crossed boundaries. Every time resentment appeared, it pointed to a moment where they had said yes while meaning no. Instead of suppressing it, they began to investigate it. There is a profound chapter on identity dismantling. The narrator describes the discomfort of no longer fitting into familiar roles. When you stop over-functioning, some relationships shift. When you stop over-explaining, some people feel uncomfortable. When you stop apologizing for existing, some dynamics break. Choosing yourself can feel lonely before it feels liberating. The book does not shy away from the grief that accompanies growth. There is mourning for the version of self that tried so hard, mourning for lost time, mourning for relationships that could not survive authenticity. Growth is not only expansion, it is also release. Another key theme in this section is discipline, not the harsh, punishing kind, but the quiet discipline of consistency. Choosing yourself once is easy compared to choosing yourself daily. It means maintaining boundaries even when guilt resurfaces. It means staying committed to your values when old habits tempt you. It means sitting with discomfort instead of escaping into people-pleasing patterns. The narrator describes small but powerful shifts, declining invitations without elaborate excuses, expressing preferences clearly, allowing silence instead of filling it to ease tension, asking directly for what is needed instead of hoping others will guess. These actions seem minor, but they accumulate into a new way of being. Fear remains present throughout this process. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of failure, fear of regret. But the relationship with fear changes. Instead of waiting for fear to disappear before acting, the narrator begins acting alongside it. Courage is reframed not as the absence of fear, but as movement despite it. There's also a deep exploration of self-trust. Years of outsourcing decisions to external approval had weakened it.
Rebuilding self-trust requires making choices and living with their outcomes. It requires forgiving yourself when mistakes happen. It requires proving to yourself repeatedly that you can survive discomfort. Midway through this section comes a powerful realization. Choosing yourself is not a single decision, it is a practice. It is choosing long-term peace over short-term validation. It is choosing honesty over image. It is choosing growth over familiarity. The narrator begins noticing subtle shifts in energy, less exhaustion from overcommitting, less anxiety from pretending, more clarity in communication, more calm in solitude. For the first time, being alone does not feel like abandonment, it feels like alignment. Part 2 concludes not with perfection, but with stability. The narrator is no longer at war internally. There are still hard days, there are still doubts, but the foundation has shifted. The voice inside is no longer accusatory, it is supportive. The identity is no longer built around external applause, it is rooted in internal integrity. The inner shift is complete. The person who once abandoned themselves for acceptance is learning to accept themselves first.
If Part 1 was awakening and Part 2 was reconstruction, Part 3 is integration. It is the stage where choosing yourself is no longer an act of rebellion, nor an act of recovery. It becomes your normal way of living. The shift is no longer loud. It is steady. It is embodied. It is quiet confidence. The narrator begins this final section by describing something unexpected, peace. Not constant happiness, not dramatic success, but peace, the kind that comes from alignment. For the first time, decisions are not followed by days of second-guessing. Conversations are not replayed endlessly at night. There is less mental noise because there is less internal contradiction. Becoming unapologetically yourself does not mean becoming loud, aggressive, or indifferent to others. It means becoming clear. Clear about your values, clear about your limits, clear about what you will no longer negotiate. The narrator explains that clarity eliminates confusion, not only for you, but for everyone around you. One of the most transformative realizations in this section is that boundaries do not push healthy people away, they filter. The relationships that survive your growth become deeper. Conversations become more honest. Love becomes less conditional. There is less performance and more presence. There is a powerful chapter on authenticity. The narrator reflects on how exhausting it was to constantly adjust personality depending on the room, to shrink around dominant personalities, to exaggerate strengths to impress, to hide vulnerabilities to appear strong. Living authentically feels lighter because there is no script to maintain. The book emphasizes that becoming yourself is not about creating a new personality. It is about uncovering what was always there beneath fear. The assertiveness that once felt unnatural was actually buried confidence. The desire for solitude was not antisocial, it was self-connection. The need for rest was not laziness, it was sustainability. There's also a deeper exploration of purpose. When you stop chasing borrowed dreams, space opens for discovering your own. The narrator describes rediscovering interests that were once dismissed as impractical, exploring ideas without immediately monetizing them, allowing curiosity to lead instead of comparison.
Comparison, in fact, becomes irrelevant in this stage, not because others stop succeeding, but because your metric changes. Success is no longer external validation, it becomes internal congruence. A successful day is one lived honestly. A successful relationship is one where you can breathe freely. The narrator speaks about forgiveness, not only forgiving others, but forgiving themselves. Forgiving the years spent people-pleasing, forgiving missed opportunities, forgiving the younger self who didn't yet know how to choose differently. Without self-forgiveness,
growth turns into shame. With forgiveness, growth turns into wisdom. There is a beautiful reflection on solitude. What once felt lonely now feels restorative. Silence is no longer uncomfortable. It becomes a place to think, reflect, recalibrate. Choosing yourself includes enjoying your own company, not as isolation, but as grounding. Courage evolves in this stage. It is no longer dramatic. It is subtle. It shows up in saying, "This doesn't work for me," in ending conversations respectfully, in walking away without needing the last word, in choosing long-term integrity over short-term approval. The book also addresses setbacks. Choosing yourself does not immunize you against doubt. Old habits attempt to resurface under stress. The difference now is awareness. The narrator catches themselves sooner, apologizes less for existing, recovers faster from emotional triggers. Growth is not linear, but it is visible. One of the most powerful ideas in this final section is this: when you finally choose yourself, you do not become selfish, you become stable. And stable people love better. They give freely because they are not giving from depletion. They support others without abandoning themselves. Toward the end, the narrator reflects on the sentence that began the transformation. "I will no longer abandon myself to keep others comfortable." Now, that sentence feels less like a declaration and more like a truth already lived. The life described in the final pages is not perfect. There are still responsibilities, challenges, uncertainties, but there is ownership, there is agency, there is self-respect, and perhaps most importantly, there is peace. The book closes with a quiet understanding. Choosing yourself is not a single dramatic moment. It is a daily practice of alignment. It is listening to your inner voice before the outer noise. It is honoring your limits without shame. It is building a life that feels like home from the inside. "When I finally chose myself" ends not with a grand victory, but something deeper. A person who stands comfortably in their own identity, no longer waiting for permission to exist fully. And that is the true transformation.